Welcome back. We've seen regularity theories of laws of nature. We've seen problems with those theories. And now we're going to see Dretski's necessitarian account of laws of nature. So he's going to begin by formulating regularity theory in his own way. We've already seen sort of two slightly different formulations. And formulations continue to sort of get more complex as more problems arise and they have to add, an extra number, an extra rule to take care of that. So uh, Dretski simplifies it a little bit. He says, look, first of all, here's why anybody would believe regularity theory in the first place. And this is a good, when you're writing your paper, right, and you're talking about the theory or something that you're going to eventually argue against or refute, it's good to motivate it, is what we call it. Motivating it means tell us why anyone would care about it, why it's worth even refuting, right? If worth refuting, it must be appealing to some people, right? And that's what Gretzky does here. So he says, look, people who argue for regularity theory, they say something like, observations of F's being G's, and again, F's and G's just arbitrary predicates, so all swans being white or all objects falling towards the Earth at 9.81 meters per second squared, right? Plug in whatever uh, generalization you want to. The idea is observations of F's being G's never provide evidence for any stronger claim than that F's are in fact G's, right? Um, again, I can just claim an observed regularity, right? And he says, trying to prove anything stronger, anything about F's necessarily being G's, it would be sort of like trying to prove all bachelors are unmarried, or trying to prove that that is analytic, right, or true in virtue of meaning by providing examples of unmarried bachelors. Right? You can't, if you went around saying, look, here's a bachelor, he's unmarried, there's another one, he's unmarried, see, so all bachelors are unmarried is analytically true. Well, that's just sort of the wrong kind of evidence for a claim about analyticity, right? And similarly, regularity theorists would say all our scientific observations, they're the wrong kind of evidence for any claims about necessity, right? All a law could ever be is a description of what it is, because that's all the evidence we ever have. So that's he's motivating regularity theory, but now he's going to start knocking it down. He says, look, our concept of a scientific law just is much more than a mere regularity, right? So one way at getting at that is showing that scientific laws have certain properties that just mere generalizations don't have, right? So one of these properties that laws have is opacity. So what do we mean by opacity? That's a It's something that we talk about in a few different contexts in philosophy, and it always has to do with what we call coextensive predicates. So a coextensive predicate are words that pick out the same set of objects. Um, so, for example, Nate. Well, that's a name. What's a predicate? So, the instructor of this course, right, picks me out. Husband of Letizia Ragusa also picks me out, right? So those are coextensive predicates because they pick out the same person, right? Um, in universal statements, those will be interchangeable, right? Any generalization you wanted to make about me as the instructor will also happen to be true if you substitute husband of Ragusa, right? Um, for example, all diamonds have a refractive index of 2.419. Now, this is a law of nature. Um, but you cannot substitute all things mined and kimberlite have a refractive 2.419. That'll still be true, right? But only because it just so happens that everything mined in kimberlite is a diamond, right? What you end up there after substituting a coextensive predicate is a true statement, right? A true generalization. We wouldn't want to call it a law, right? Why? Because there's no lawful connection between where the thing is mined and its refractive index. That doesn't explain the refractive index, right? There's something about being in diamond that has that index. I'm going to scoot over. I'm getting blasted in the face by the sun. Okay, so this failure of substitution, right? So we've got predicates that pick out the same things, right? The word diamond, type of object, right? A certain set of objects in the world. things mined in kimberlite also happens to pick out all the diamonds. It picks out all the same things, right? So those predicates are coextensive, right? Um, but in certain contexts, you can't substitute them and still have a scientific law, right? So this failure of substitution for coextensive predicates called opacity, right? Um, Universal generalizations are not opaque in that way. Only laws are opaque in that way, right? So a true generalization, you can make the substitutions, and when you can make those substitutions of coextensive predicates, that's called being transparent. Um, just to explain, you may have heard about opacity in a slightly different context, right? Um, in beliefs, for example. So sometimes when we state what a person believes, there's also an opacity there where you can't substitute coextensive names or predicates. For example, um, Lois believes that Superman saved the day. Right? Now that's true, but Lois believes that Clark Kent saved the day might be false. Why? Because Lois doesn't know that Superman is Clark Kent, right? So she might not have that belief. Now here, the the opacity, right, the failure of substitution turns a true statement into a false statement. Now, in the case of the laws, right, the statement all things mined in kimberlite have a refractive index of 2.419, that was still true, right? So the sort of opacity that's going on there is just that it lost its status as a law, right? When we substituted all things mined in kimberlite for diamonds, we got a true statement, but that wasn't a law of nature anymore. So, regularity theorists uh, might try to address this, right? We've seen, this is one of a sort of a long list of problems with regularity theory we've seen. Regularity theorists might say, okay, yeah, there is this opacity issue, but it's not like a big problem. It's not like a fundamental problem. It's something we could patch up, right? Um, it has something to do with the way laws are used. I know Dretske doesn't like flesh out the response for the regularity. If you wanted to do that in a paper, you could, I suppose. But at any rate, right, whatever the problem is, right, for the regularity theorist, and we've seen a few, they'll add extra conditions, right, and try patching them on, so the regularity theory can get around this objection, that objection, and the other objection. So you could capture all of those, right, by saying, look, regularity theorists say a law of nature is a universal generalization plus some extra ingredient, right, or some list of ingredients. And Gretzky notes a few that people have tried, right? So high degree of confirmation, right? Um, something wide acceptance, um, explanatory potential, deductive integration with a larger set of statements, so sort of having a certain role in a theory. It's being useful for predictions, right? These are all sorts of things you might want to add on, and if you add those on, you might get around some of these problems. Like if you stipulate that uh, a law is a universal generalization that is also useful for predictions, then maybe you can get around the problems with breakless trains or whatever. I don't know. But to sum it all up, right, for regularity theorists, laws are universal truths plus whatever extra ingredient they need past all these objections, right? But Dretske wants to say, look, the opacity problem isn't just like another objection, right, that you can sort of wiggle your way out of by adding an extra condition, right? Um, he thinks it's an important one, right? Because he thinks the reason for this opacity problem is that laws of nature are not claiming any sort of relationship between all the things that are F and all the things that are G. The law of nature is not saying something about all the things that exist that are diamonds and all the things that exist that have a particular refractive index, right? Um, Instead, he thinks what laws of nature are doing is claiming a relationship between F-ness and G-ness, right? So that's a little odd, right? What's the distinction there between all the diamonds and the property of diamondness, right? Um, what we'll call a universal, right? And it's a we'll say more about it and it'll get fleshed out, right? So, right, there are objects out there that are diamonds, right? And for any object that's a diamond, yeah, I can say true things about it. I can say it's owned by Nate. I can say it's kept in a box, that it's in a ring, right? All that stuff will be true of that particular diamond, right? But none of that is true just in virtue of its being a diamond. Right? It has a refractive index of 2.419 just because it's a diamond, right? That's the result of its diamondness, right? Not because of being a particular diamond that a particular guy owns, right? So we Drutsky thinks that we can get a handle on what laws of nature are really trying to say if we want to say, look, we need to focus on just the pure diamondness of the thing and not all the accidental properties that actual diamonds in the world have. Right? So again, if you're just talking about a group of objects, right, then sure, you could pick them out the same group using various properties. So, and maybe this is just belaboring the point, but why not, right? Try to make it clear. If any one of these examples works for you, then great. If some of them seem confusing. Um, so here's another example. Maybe I'm super villain, right? And I buy up every diamond in the world so that I can whatever, right? And I got them all in my secret vault. So if that were the case, then sure, you could pick out all the diamonds in the world by saying everything in the box in Nate's secret vault. But again, that shouldn't be involved in the law of nature, that property, right? You shouldn't be able to say, oh, it's a law of nature that everything in this box in Nate's secret vault has a refractive index of 2.419. Again, why? Because that has nothing to do with the diamondness, right? Having the property of diamondness doesn't entail anything about being in a vault, right? So if laws are relationships among universals, right? Here I say properties, and there's some. I think Dretzky is a little loose with his terminology here, and it gets more rigorous later on, right? Um, but we should be saying universals, right? Laws are relationships among universals. You stick with that, you don't get these problems with these bad laws where you end up it being a law of nature just about some accidental problem. So this is the necessitarian view. Laws are relationships between, you might say, property types, right, or universals. Universals are things like redness itself, right? Not just the redness of a particular apple. Right, lots of apples are red, and you could even talk about, that particular apple has a particularly bright redness, right? But we're talking about redness in the abstract, the thing that all red things share, right? And what Gretzky thinks laws of nature are saying is that universals like redness and diamondness are related to each other in various specific ways, right? So redness is related to ripeness, maybe, and diamondness is related to having a particular refractive index, right? And its relations among these universals on this higher plane, right? Not about all the actual apples and all the actual diamonds, right? Now, it will entail things about actual apples and actual diamonds, right? Because apples and actual diamonds sort of instantiate these universals, um, but it doesn't go the other way around, right? The universal generalizations don't tell us anything about the laws, right? Um, Now, this is a little weird, right? So, I mean, we're going to have to kind of accept that universals are things on their own, right? That there is redness independent of any red object, right? And this is what we'll call Platonism. Next week will be all about this. Um, and Dretzky, in the end, is sort of unapologetic. Yeah, we might have to bite the bullet and say redness exists on its own, right? Even if no diamonds ever existed, diamondness would exist on its own, right? Um, but in order to sort of soften you up, to sort of swallow this sort of weird thing that we have to now posit a extra realm of existence where all the universals, right? He's going to drive it home how hopeless regularity theory is. More problems for regularity theory. Another difference between laws, sort of our general concept of laws, as Dretzky thinks we have, and just these universal statements, is that laws support counterfactuals and universal generalization. Counterfactual is something that didn't happen but could have happened, right? So, for example, suppose it's true that all dogs born at sea have been Cocker Spaniels. Who knows, right? I don't know. Probably, I don't know how many dogs have been born at sea. Maybe it just so happens they're all Cocker Spaniels because those are the kinds of dogs that, whatever, sailors like to train. Maybe that's true, right? But certainly that doesn't mean that if I took a dachshund, right, a pregnant dachshund on a boat or bred on a boat, that it would give birth to a Cocker Spaniel. Obviously not. Um, but it's hard for, again, the regularity theorists to say why that would be. Or, for example, suppose I've got a bag full of marbles and they're all red, right? Um, that's a again, that's the regularity theorist says that's a law, right? That's all the law is. Of course, they have rules about local stuff. That's not, you know, all the marbles are red. Um, that doesn't mean that if I took another marble and put it in the bag, it would become red, right? But it's hard again for the regularity theorists to get around that. And it wouldn't change anything if we added one more of these plus, if we added one of these plus X formulations to universalizations, right? So it could be highly confirmed that all the marbles in the bag were red, or right, generally accepted, and so on. All those little lists of things they want to add. It's not going to magically make any marble I add to the bag turn red, right? So again, um, we want laws to tell us about stuff that hasn't happened yet, and regularity theory can't do that. We've seen that before with the breakless train. Another difference, right, between laws as we actually conceive them and, these generalizations that the regularity theorist wants to say are laws is about the way they're confirmed, right? So a law of nature can be confirmed by observing it to be true over and over, roughly. Um, so I can increase the probability that everyone in this room is over 30 by, or I can increase the probability that that generalization is true, right, by entering the room myself because I'm over 30. Go around confirming that generalization. Um, but that means nothing, right, as far as like predictability. It doesn't tell me anything about how old the next person in the room is going to be, right? It's a very useless kind of confirmation, even though, again, according to the regularity theorists, that would count as confirmation, right? Because again, all regularity theory is doing is observing regularities, right? Um, what we really need, what we're looking for with confirmation is an explanatory hypothesis, right? So um, if the room was a 20th high school reunion, right, then that would explain um, why there's a good probability that everyone is over 30, right? So I worry that this example may be a little confusing for people. Don't worry too much about it. Um, but what Dretke's trying to say is that laws are supposed to explain things, not just describe. That should, at this point, you should get that out of regularity theory is just describing the world, but laws are supposed to be explaining the world too. So I really like this quote from Gretzky, so I'm gonna quote it. The fact that every f is G fails to explain why any f is G. And it fails to explain it not because its explanatory efforts are too feeble to have attracted our attention, but because the explanatory attempt is never even made. The fact that all men are mortal does not explain why you and I are mortal. It says, in the sense of implies, that we are mortal, but it does not even suggest why this might be so, right? So I like this Chesky article because I think he tries to cut to the core of the problems of regularity theory, right? And not just raise a list of objections that the regular theorists might, you know, slap away by adding more conditions to their theory. Look, laws are supposed to be explanatory, right? They're not just supposed to tell us what we observe and what happens. They're supposed to tell us in some sense why what happens happens. Regularity theory just can't do that. So if we think about laws as relationships between properties, as universals, right, that's going to solve these problems. The property of being a diamond, right, what entails its index, uh, not the property of where it was mined, right? Again, remember the example mined in Kimberley. Diamonds, right? They all have a refractive index of 2.419 because everything mined in kimberlite is a diamond, right? But it's the diamondness that explains the refractive index and not where it was. The property of being a 20th high school reunion is what entails a room full of people over 30. Viewing, right, laws as relationships between universals also allows us to support counterfactuals. So I can say if this rock were a diamond, it would have a refractive index of 2.419, right? Um, it won't turn out to be a law that all dogs born at sea are cocker spaniels, again, because there's no connection between the property of being born at sea and of being a cocker spaniel. Um, and none of this relies on human investigation or what we've observed. These universals, these properties and their relations, they're going to exist whether or not we know about them, right? The laws of nature concerning right human biology existed before humans evolved. The universals were out there. A little weird, right? There was a universal human being, right, in Plato's heaven, or wherever, in the realm of universals before there was ever a human, right? And it was that law existed. One way to maybe, I don't know if this metaphor helps, but Dresky might. You could think about universals and the relations between universals like political offices that are set up by constitution. It's not the particular person in the office so much that determines the roles they serve, the way they behave, the office itself as defined. And again, this is these are purely laws are still purely contingent, right? They're not analytic truths like all bachelors are married or like 2 + 2 = 4, right? These are contingent things. The acceleration of gravity could be different, right, in a different world with different laws. Um, so they're not logically necessary, but once they're set up the way they are, there is going to be a necessity, right, that anyone who has that job will have to behave in a certain way, right? And must do certain things you can't do when you hold a particular office. Um, so whatever necessity is involved, right? If this is a necessitarian account of laws of nature, but it's not necessity in the way that 2 + 3 = 4, necessity in the way that these universals exist and their relation. Once I understand what it is to be a G, right, and to be an F, then we understand that if you are a G, you must be an F, right? Um, and it'll make counterfactuals will make sense. If I were an F, then I would be a G, even though I'm not in fact an F. So if I were the sheriff of Los Angeles County, then I would be required to enforce certain laws. If I were a diamond, I would have a refractive index of 2.419. And again, regularity theory generalizations just can't capture this facet of laws. They can only talk about what is, right? Because that's all they're doing is describing what is. And laws can tell us what can happen because they're latched into a sort of realm of existence here. And this, Dresky thinks, is why laws explain laws of relationships between universals. Quote that I like. The period of a pendulum decreases when we shorten the length of the bob, not because all pendulums do that, but because period and length are related in the fashion, and then he's got the formula for that, right? So again, he's saying, yeah, we're not right. Point is regularity theory doesn't explain anything, right? If you ask why, right, does the period of the pendulum change when you change the length of the bob, they say it always does that, right? And he wants to say no. There's a law of nature. It's a mathematical equation, right? And that's the reason, right? It describes the relation between the property of having a certain length and the property of a certain period. So again, though, it's a little weird, right? What the heck are Fness and genus? I don't. He seems to be talking about diamondness, floating free from any object, right? I've only ever seen an actual diamond. Where is diamond? Um, why should I believe in that sort of thing? It seems sort of spooky. Can't Isn't there a way out of it? And people have tried to work around this. Lewis has an account, right, where he tries to avoid commitment to universals. Ends up being committed to some other weird things like possible worlds being existing. Um, Gretzky here just bites the bullet on this weirdness, and he says, "Yeah, I guess we have to believe in universals, right, that exist independently of any objects, um, because without them we wouldn't have laws of nature, and we want to have laws of nature. Those are important. And so, in order to get laws of nature as we actually right conceive them, and not as the regularity theorists imagines we can get away with, we have to just believe in universals. So." That's why now next week I want to move into universals, right? Which again I wanted to ground it in science because I thought it gives us a little more weight to the discussion we're having next week, which might be a little weird to people if we have a reason to even start to, but it's pretty heavy. Like it's maybe the best account I think of nature. You have to believe in universals. So we're going to talk about that next week.